Thank you, Mauricia. It is very, very rare that you get your students to say nice things about you. So I am relishing and enjoying this moment tremendously. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker of the House, Mr. Jomo Thomas, members of Parliament, members of Cabinet, head of the Open Campus, my colleague, Mrs. Dalrymple, colleagues, staff of the Open Campus, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in particular Ronnie, who I will say something more about later, was instrumental in bringing me here. Present and former students, I see many of you. It is really a shock and surprise when I forget some of your names, although you never forget the face. Or sometimes the teachers say it's the other way around. You never forget the name. You might forget the face. But I see some of my very dear students here. In fact, some of the brightest students that I have taught have always come from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I'm not saying that because I am here today. And some of my dearest friends are also from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I don't see any of them here tonight, so I have to question their friendship. But I spent I think 3 of my best years at Cambridge University with Rudy Matthias, who was almost like a roommate to me because as 2 Caribbean boys, we had no choice but to rely on each other. And many other friends from St. Vincent, students, friends, comrades, good evening. Let me first of all begin by thanking the leadership of the Open Campus, St. Vincent, for inviting me here to deliver tonight's talk, and for all the excellent arrangements made for my participation here today. I have a story to tell. I wouldn't say it now, but I should say, even if the media is here, they can report me. But because of the crop over in Barbados, which is just ending this week, I had to rely on a new airline to take me to, when I say new, I mean a non-LIAT airline, to take me to the Caribbean, to take me to St. Vincent. And after today, my experience is that I have continued to respect and to cherish the role of LIAT in the Caribbean. That's all I will say on the matter. But thanks to I am here. I also want to thank specifically Zita for providing a very sumptuous lunch, at least sponsoring it for me here today. When I got in, straight from the airport, we walked right into a lunch that she kindly and very thoughtfully agreed to sponsor, and I thank her for that. In expressing gratitude, I am moved to note that the contextual background for tonight's talk arose from a paper which I delivered to the annual conference of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies, Legalease, in April. In attendance at that conference was Ronnie Daniel, who extended an invitation for me to deliver the paper to a wider audience in St. Vincent and the Grenadines as part of the, as you've heard, the Open Campuses Issues in International Affairs series. I was happy to accept the invitation, firstly because of the, you might be surprised to hear, immense level of political satisfaction and optimism I always feel whenever I see my St. Lucian passport stamped with the words indefinite stay, whenever I touch down on a sister OECS country. I never refuse the chance to travel to any OECS country just to see the immigration officer stamp indefinite stay on my passport. It gives me a sense of a wider sovereignty. And if my country used to be 238 square miles and 180,000 people, it has now been multiplied several fold. So I speak here as a citizen of St. Vincent and the Grenadines because nobody can deport me. And Gramsci used to say to us that we are always supposed to maintain an optimism of the will despite the pessimism of the intellect. And seeing my passport stamped with indefinite stay contributes to the nourishment of my will because it gives me a sense of progress, and it is a significant step in the march of our movement towards a unified Caribbean population. So I extend my gratitude to all the technocrats and political leaders who made it possible. So we often criticize them, but sometimes we forget that they do some very important things. And OECS integration is certainly ranking very high up there. But secondly, and most importantly, I was moved to accept the invitation from Mrs. Dalrymple and Ronnie because of the urgency of the moment in which we live and my desire to share with you some of my reflections on some aspects of our current political condition. For the past few years, much of my research, as you have heard, has revolved around exploring how the entrenchment of neoliberal ideas and practice have been overturning and reversing the economic and social relations and the political arrangements which had defined our post-colonial Caribbean. A counter-revolution by stealth has been taking place since the 1980s, in which the hard-won social and political gains of the Caribbean working class are now being reversed and eroded. Of particular concern to me is the fact that whilst these developments are radically changing the long-held social relations of the post-colonial Caribbean, very few of our intellectuals, public servants, teachers, and members of the political class have been seeking consciously to detail, expose, and discuss their implications. In a classic expression of the Gramscian notion of hegemony, our normally perceptive and critical thinkers have been treating these disruptive developments as normal and everyday and commonplace, and consequently, they have failed to develop the intellectual tools and lenses to perceive the current moment for what it is. It is a moment when our sovereignty is being reversed, when the internal ruling classes which had been overcome during the anti-colonial struggle have reasserted themselves, when the social gains won by the working people as part of the independent social contract are now being denied, and when our thinkers and technocrats are so overwhelmed by the intellectual claims of neoliberalism that they have in many instances willingly participated in these developments under the guise of the so-called economic orthodoxy. This, therefore, is the intellectual and political background against which I wish to frame my talk tonight. I have entitled tonight's talk, Any Cook Can Govern, Plato, Donald Trump, and the Rise of the Caribbean Businessmen Politicians. And Mrs. Dalrymple has challenged me to make the connection between Plato and Donald Trump. But before I make the connection, Mrs. Dalrymple, I'll tell you, I teach Western political thought. And I teach some of the students here. And when I teach Plato, they think that I am teaching an old, dead white man. So every chance I get to demonstrate his relevance, at least to make myself meaningful too, I take it. And I hope to do that tonight too. And some of them are here, so that when I teach them Plato, I think I want them to understand I'm teaching them, I'm giving them tools for life, and not just reading something from a book, but you must connect it to your reality. And that's what makes it make sense for you. And that is what I hope to do tonight, and I accept your challenge. So that is my title, Any Cook Can Govern, Plato, Donald Trump, and the Rise of Caribbean Businessmen Politicians. Admittedly, I was moved to think about the topic on that night in April 2016, when Alan Chasney won the election in St. Lucia. An untried businessman with no historical involvement in the politics, became the Prime Minister of St. Lucia after successfully wresting power from Dr. Kenny Anthony, with whom I was privileged to work in the capacity of his attaché between 2000 and 2003. So that's my personal motivation. And you must always make your personal motivations clear so people can understand where you're coming from. Months later, when my initial surprise at Chasney's victory had been replaced by sober reflection, And when Donald Trump emerged as President of the United States of America, I realized that both Chastney and Trump's victories were the result of the same architectonic, structural, and ideological issues reflecting themselves in contemporary early 21st century politics. Both elections were fought on the basis of an electorate frustrated with established politics, with voters opting to vote for something new. On the basis of the ideological hegemony of neoliberalism, both the St. Lucian and the US electors assumed that the country's challenges could be resolved by business persons rather than by so-called professional politicians. However, since the elections, both countries have experienced what I call disnormative political developments. By disnormative, I mean bad things are happening, largely arising out of the political inexperience and the crude application of the ideological business-oriented concerns of the respective leaders. But these failures themselves are symptomatic of deeper crises confronting capitalist democracies in the present and are manifesting themselves, at least to us on the surface, most clearly as failures of leadership. Given the evidence of bad government, which has followed both the US and the St. Lucian elections, the suggestions of deeper crises to come, and the evidence of similar tendencies in other Caribbean countries, my focus in tonight's talk is to use the contradictory views of ancient Greek philosopher Plato, who insisted on specific criteria for leadership. That's one connection. And those of Trinidadian intellectual C.L.R. James, who adopted an alternative stance that any cook can govern, to tease out the implications for present-day Caribbean politics. In my talk, I will be using Plato's reflections on the criteria for true political leadership as a measuring rod against which to assess the outcomes of the 2016 elections in the USA and similar shifts to the CEO leadership in the Caribbean. My main argument is that the criteria for good government, which Plato had outlined, were premised on an objective and timeless set of measurements which possessed, I still feel, a high degree of validity and applicability. I argue that with the rise of neoliberalism, Plato's warnings against the business class, and he did say some very specific things about the business class. I'll show it to you. These warnings have been reversed, and an ideological context conducive to businessmen as political rulers have taken hold, with significant negative consequences for our governance. So these are my tasks. To achieve these goals, tonight, I propose to do the following. First, I will provide a brief discussion of Plato's argument for a government of specially trained leaders, and will examine the basis of C.L.R. James's counter-argument for a loosening of the criteria for rulership. Following this, I will identify how the emergence of neoliberal hegemony has overturned the earlier concerns of Plato and have created the context conducive to the emergence of businessmen as political leaders, or what I call CEO politicians. And I will show the implications for governance arising from this development. Thirdly, I will turn to the concrete developments in the Caribbean and the USA. In other words, I'll present the empirical evidence of what I'm trying to say. So I'm asking you to bear with me. I'm going to work through some theory first, and then I will come to give you, demonstrate for you what I see happening in the USA and the Caribbean. And I'll be showing how the businessmen politicians have emerged, and I will be hoping to demonstrate concretely how this has led to bad and destructive government. And I will end with a brief normative discussion of how people who I call progressives, who I know still exist, how the anti-neoliberal progressive political actors in the region should understand and respond to these developments. That is what I'm hoping to do tonight, and I hope you can stay with me to the end, and we can discuss after. So let me turn to my first task. I'm trying to make a case for why I use Plato, and I want to clarify why his perspective is necessary as a critical perspective of the rise of businessmen politicians in the Caribbean. When he was writing, Plato was confronted with what he saw as the political decay of his native Athens. He was a young man, and like most young men, very impatient with bad politics, because young men want to change the world. So Plato, in reflecting on what he saw happening in Athens, presented an analysis and a remedy against political degeneration. And I think his prescriptions, which is why I'm using them, have become the classic statement on the requirements of good government, and which I believe is relevant to our own concerns with the political degeneration in our own time. So I'm hoping to also demonstrate for you, perhaps towards the end, evidence of the political degeneration of which I speak, although maybe that might be the easiest task in my paper because you know the evidence for yourself. At the center of Plato's criticism was his view that the problems confronting Athenian society resided in the fact that its form of democracy, its form of participatory democracy, placed the responsibility for government in the hands of persons who were unsuited to the task of government. Sounds familiar? Describing the Athenian model of popular democracy as bad government and as government by the whim of the multitude, Plato saw the problem as residing in the easy access to rulership by those who were unsuited to government. The main problem with democracy is that it encouraged those with little aptitude for government to offer themselves for public office. So in his view, Plato argued, and that was a prescription he offered, and I'll quote for you. I'm quoting, "The state in which the rulers are most reluctant to govern is always the best and most quietly governed, and the state in which they are most eager, the worst." On the basis of these observations, Plato therefore proposed that government should be made so unattractive that only those fully committed to the challenges of leadership, that is, those who were not political opportunists, that's the language we can use, would offer themselves for office, since in his view, and I'm quoting again, "Whereas if they go to the administration of public affairs, poor and hungering after their own private advantage, thinking that hence they are to snatch the chief good, order there can never be. For they will be fighting about office, and the civil and democratic broils which thus arise will be the ruin of the rulers themselves and of the whole state." Plato's observation sprang from his firm belief that leadership was a distinctly specialized activity. I'm sure you're hearing now, anybody can be a prime minister. That's what you're hearing now. Anybody can be a prime minister. Plato was insisting that leadership was a distinctly specialized activity requiring special training, wisdom, skill, insight, and specific and rare personal and moral faculties. This placed the responsibility for rulership in the hands of specifically prepared individuals naturally suited to the task, whom he described as philosopher kings. We're not going to trouble ourselves with that now. To paraphrase all of this to our time and place, as I said to you earlier, not anyone can be a prime minister. It is useful to point out that the assumptions guiding Plato's prescriptions were rooted in notions of the organic state. The central feature of the organic state is the survival of the social whole. Within the organic view, the state did not exist for the fulfillment of man's private advantage, but existed for the community as a whole. In short, there was a moral dimension to man surrendering himself to the political order and knowing his rightful place, since this contributed to the collective survival of all. That is why I am using Plato. It is on this basis that we can understand how Plato's observations make him relevant to my concerns about the political emergence of businessmen as political rulers, as a deliberate political idea and practice in the present time. Arising out of his understanding of political order as being an intrinsic good, Plato placed central emphasis on an occupational division of labor as a critical element in the maintenance of good government. This division of labor was closely related to the moral and spiritual aptitude of the various occupational groups of society, and it was threefold. I have it on the back on the slide. You can just read the slide to make it make a little more sense. I think it's more interesting than hearing my own voice. There were three classes, and you can see them here, the executive and the government. These were always a minority, remember that? The ruling group is always a minority. If you watch the Olympic Games, the same argument can be held. The athletic group is always a minority. You don't have 1,000 Usain Bolts. You understand me? You don't have 1,000 Usain Bolts. The ruling group is always a minority, and it comes out of those people who make all governmental decisions and who form the government. The auxiliaries, another group, their role is to physically defend the state, the soldiers, and you can see the characters there. I'll go to that in a while. And the third group, which is where we now concern with our businessmen, he placed them in the third group. These were the producers, and they included workers as well. The producers, workers, merchants, traders, businessmen. These were engaged in economic activity and provided for the material sustenance of the society. In Plato's formulation, each group's occupational specialization corresponded to what he called a specific type of soul. I'm not going to go too much into that, but I'm just telling you what he said. We can discuss it later. A particular type of soul which contribute to the successful operation of the whole society and of the whole individual. What is important to us is that the producers, that's the class that I'm interested in tonight. The producers, that is workers and businessmen, were guided by what he called an appetitive soul. They were concerned with appetite. Anything below the belly, below the heart, is appetite, and you can go as low as you want. They were guided by an appetitive soul, marked by emotion and desire, and he said they want and feel many things. And in Plato's view, these carnal and material desires of the business class rule them out as political rulers, since they lack the capacity for objectivity and cannot act in the interest of society as a whole. They are naturally predisposed to act in the interest of private profit, self-aggrandizement, and personal advantage, and this renders them unsuited as political rulers and guardians of the state. One of the main questions which I'll be asking tonight is, how did Plato's specific warnings about the business class become so irrelevant that today we now wallow in the opposite claim that business acumen is the main and attractive qualification for political leadership? To answer that question, perhaps we should turn to the alternative perspective offered by Caribbean scholar C.L.R. James. In his 1956 paper, Every Cook Can Govern, James presented a defense of democracy which ran diametrically counter to Plato's insistence on government of specially trained persons. James lowered the bar to rulership to any member of society. He rejected the characterization of political leadership as an activity only for the specially selected chosen few, and argued instead, and I have a long quote from him which I will read, any worker selected at random could do the work that the average CIO bureaucrat or labor member of parliament in Britain was doing. In his view, and I quote, modern parliamentary democracy elects representatives, and these representatives constitute the government. But the democracy came into power, but before the democracy came into power, he's referring to Greek democracy, the Greeks had been governed by various forms of government, including government by representatives. The democracy knew representative government and rejected it. It refused to believe that the ordinary citizen was not able to perform practically all the business of government. For the Greek, a man who did not take part in politics was an idiotes. Not only did the Greeks choose all officials by lot, they limited their time of service. When a man had served once, as a general rule, he was excluded from serving again because the Greeks believed in rotation, everybody taking his turn to administer the state. So in James's view, any cook can govern. In fact, he was told later that his title was an insult to cooks. He said, I didn't mean to insult cooks, but the fact he was trying to say is that anybody can govern, which is where I think we are now. I'll try to say something more about that in a while. It is important to note that just as Plato's ideal state was contextualized within the understanding of the organic state, then similarly was James aware that the popular participatory democracy was rooted in notions of the responsibility of the individual to society and not the other way around. In other words, you had to participate in public life because it was a duty. Now, bear those things in mind because I'm aware that I'm talking about people who were discussing a political culture of a different time. But what I'm trying to argue is that let us look at the arguments and apply them in a creative way to our current moment. So both James and Plato believe in the idea of public participation as an ideal, not out of self-interest. That's the critical point. Not because I want to be a minister, not because I want to help my friends, but as a kind of, almost like a public sacrifice. Now, mind you, if you talk to any present-day politician, and there's some of them in the room, they will agree with me that it does involve a lot of personal sacrifice. But the motivation to enter it are not noble, nor are they high. They are mostly individualistic and selfish, and I'll come to that in a while. Despite the competing visions of Plato and James on the desirability of specialist training and experience as a criteria for political leadership, and despite the differences in outlook on the questions of democracy and governance, they are united in a view of politics, which I was just explaining, in which the decision makers are guided by decisions or notions of the collective good, and they both reject the notion of government by special interests. So we now come to what has happened to Plato and James's notion of organic participation out of public interest. Given the divergences and convergences of the perspectives of Plato and C.L.R. James, I think we are now ready to answer the question which I asked earlier. What has happened to our politics that the earlier warnings against the control of the business class over the political process became so irrelevant that today we are now wallowing in the opposite claim that business acumen is an attractive qualification for political leadership? In answering this question, we can now turn to my second task, which is to examine the features of neoliberal ideology which has softened the battlefield over the last 40 to 20 years, resulting today in our intellectual acceptance of businessmen as political rulers. And I want to turn very briefly, and I want you to walk with me as I show you some of the deep intellectual and ideological claims about neoliberalism to show you the connection that has brought us to what we have now. Among the principal assumptions of neoliberalism include the privileging of private capital over the social good. Now, these are all very familiar to you. They're so familiar that they have now become normal, and you don't see them as a problem. That's what Gramsci meant by hegemony. The privileging of private capital over the social good. The privileging of the individual over the social. Margaret Thatcher told us there is no such thing as society. The idea that the state should retreat from the economic sphere every day. The technocrats who we produce in the econ department at UWI tell us that, spew that Kool-Aid to us all the time. Oh, the state should retreat. The state should let go. Let the private sector govern. As if these are common sense things and you shouldn't argue against them. That the state should retreat from the economic sphere and should confine itself, and they tell you what it should confine itself to. They say, oh, security and labor regulation. And I always ask them, what was the colonial state? Describe the colonial state for me. It was doing two things: security and labor regulation and extracting resources from our region. That was the colonial state. No schools, no roads, no hospitals, because it wasn't serving a public. It was serving a colonial administration. But today the neoliberals want to tell you that is the form, the normal form of the state. You shouldn't do health. You shouldn't do education. No money. Right then, you see? So, the state should defend the business class. When there's a riot, bring police on the streets. Hire money for security because the USA tells you about ISIS and so forth. So that's the colonial state form. But the neoliberal state is now reproducing that. There are more features. The so-called end of ideology. If you notice what I was saying to you was sounding odd, right? What I was saying to you is sounding ideological. Joseph is being ideological. Right. You're not ideological. Everybody is ideological. The church is ideological. My grandmother is ideological too, when she believed in a Virgin Mary. But you are too ideological because we are, no, we are at the end of ideology. And upon this notion of the end of ideology is the notion that there is no alternative. Margaret Thatcher's TINA, T-I-N-A. So when we elect our representatives, despite what they have in the manifesto, there is no alternative. So we should just close down the election then. If there is no alternative, what are you all debating in the first place? If all of you going to do the same thing, or there is only one way, then there's no politics. That's what they mean by the death of politics. That's what you heard the neoliberals say. Oh, we are living at the end of the end of politics. The end of politics, and I'm hungry? You get me? As Bob Marley say, them belly full, but we're hungry. And the end of politics. That notion that there is no alternative has delegitimized politics as a sphere of engagement. All of you hate politics. I hate politics. When I was on the radio station with Ronnie this afternoon, the DJ asked me the first question, so we all study political science? Because politics is a bad thing. Because the world is normal, and politics is abnormal. It's the most natural thing in the world. In fact, what they do, economics now is natural. The bluffers. Economics is natural and politics is artificial. So economics doesn't have to explain itself because the market is invisible. The market is invisible. My colleague at a gender person says, anytime she hears anybody says anything about the invisible hand, she's a woman, she's closing her legs tight. The invisible hand is not invisible. Behind it is political forces. It's not natural. Politics is natural. Everybody together in a room, politics begins. That is natural. But what the neoliberals do, they want you to think that politics is unnatural and economics is natural. Capitalist economics is natural. So slavery was natural too. It was natural until you put it to an end. You get my logic? It's only natural when you accept it. But when you start to ask deep questions about it, so it was natural for a man to enslave another man. It was so natural, the Bible even justified it. So slavery is natural. The economy is natural. Men engage in economics naturally. They don't get in politics naturally too. Man arguing about things and resolving problems is the most natural thing. So politics is natural. Politics doesn't have to explain itself. Economics has to explain itself. Get my logic? Or to be quite fair, because I'm getting a little polemical now, perhaps they are both natural. You understand my logic? If you take economics to mean the basic survival, eating, that's economics. So they're all natural. But don't tell me that politics has to be contained and the economy is natural. Anyway, I don't want to be too long on it. That leads me to the next point, the death of politics, which I'm already implying to you. The assumption that all major political questions have been resolved and the only role left for politics is administration. That's why you have the rise of technocrats. So if it is if politics is dead, then the next step is, let us have a government of technocrats. Technical people can solve, as if politics is so, as if there are no contest, nothing to contest. There's no contestation. So I remember in St. Lucia, there was this claim from one politician, who I respect, that we need a government of national unity. So I asked him, well, form it for me. Let me see how you're going to form it. He said, well, the best engineer will be Minister of Works. The best doctor will be Minister of Health. The best educator will be Minister of Education. And everything, we all live happily ever after. In the first place, you can't even agree on who's the best engineer. You understand what I'm telling you? And in any event, let us assume you want to take the best engineer based on his experience and qualification. That may be possible. He might tell you, we have to build a school here. Because we have to build a bridge here, because the natural rock formations take a bridge best. And as an engineer, I say a bridge. But the people say, I want a school. So how is that to be resolved? You think an engineer can resolve that? You think his engineering can resolve that? Politics can resolve that. School versus bridge. Politics can resolve it. Get my logic? So don't come with this story about the death of politics, and which implies that all major political questions have been resolved, and the only role left for politics is administration. This is why we see technocrats emerging to positions of power at the expense of traditional politicians, from campaign manager to prime minister. So my older colleagues will remember, who was a campaign manager 40 years ago? Today, a campaign manager presents for you his qualification and so forth. He can run the computer and so forth. His campaign manager. He can help you. He can tally votes on a computer. His campaign manager is a technocrat. And the technocrat is king. Because all politics, so he's not concerned about ideas. He's not concerned about ideology, which is not a bad word. He's not concerned about principle. He's not concerned about deep issues. He's concerned about winning the election. And as a technocrat, they can win you the election, but you have bad government afterwards. And we see it all the time. Sometimes the best technocrat can win the election, and he's the worst politician. You all saw it in the USA too. I'll come to him in a while. He basically had to count. He knew what it was to win the Electoral College, and he did what he had to do. So he didn't care. He doesn't care now. Now that his rating is below, is around 30%. In his first 6 months, he doesn't care. He won the election. It has opened the way. I'm getting ahead of myself. It has opened the way for opportunism, bluff politics, and PR and pretense, since real politics is dead. The main consequence is the collapse of democracy, since the legitimate sphere for public dissent is now closed. It has also opened the door for the CEO with no political experience. And there's more. Under neoliberal ideology, we have seen the sacrificing of democracy and political legitimacy for economic objectives of private capital accumulation or getting the economy right. Right now, the aim of the political ruler is to get the economy right. People starving and dying, you know. But we have to get the economy right. Now, you know, when they say get the economy right, what they mean? They have to meet IMF standards. That's what they mean. Now, that's not ideology now, too. The IMF has no ideology. The IMF, so we are all technocrats. And our job is to make the societies resemble what the IMF wants it to look like. So then I ask the question, so why the hell you have elections? If the IMF prescription is what the state is going to do anyway, so then why the pretense every 5 years in this big brouhaha with two parties fighting each other? In the end, all the technocrats and their leaders want to get the economy right because there is no alternative. Tina. Indeed, many of the neoliberal ideologues reduce legitimacy to getting the economy right. You would not believe me. A student from St. Vincent, I don't see him in the crowd now, asked me that question. I said to him, you know, in my early years, I said to him, economics is concerned with efficiency, because I'm trying to explain the difference between political science and economics. I said, you know, the economist is concerned mainly with efficiency. That's how his mind works. And the political scientist, the politician or political scientist, is more concerned with legitimacy. You know what his response was? Sir, if it is efficient, it must be legitimate. I said, that's where you get it wrong. That's where you get it wrong. Because if you think because it is efficient, it's legitimate. But I can efficiently arrive at the way of killing all of you in the room. That make it legitimate? I can efficiently decide to close half the schools because efficiency dictates that. That makes it legitimate? The political scientist is concerned with legitimacy. To say what it is that we should do, not what it is that the economy demands to be done. You see the distinction? But a lot of them reduce legitimacy to getting the economy right. If you look at the manifestos, we're in a terrible state now, you know. Their manifestos actually glory in that nonsense, you know, getting the economic fundamentals right, and children to have education, youth unemployment is growing and so forth, people are hungry and so forth. Their grandfathers were better off than them. You understand me? And I say so in all seriousness. As a measure of progress, the condition of our, let's say our parents, and I'm coming from Barbados, where their fathers had free education and they don't have it now. So I'm talking nonsense? Their fathers were better off than them because the Prime Minister decided free education for all. And when they asked him how he's going to do it, he said, God will provide. When the economists asked him, how are you going to do it? You want to break the treasury? He said, God will provide. And for about 4 decades, they had free education because God provided it. And now the people who have now inherited the state from him are now saying, we can't do because the economy can't take it anymore. You understand me? A generation of we can't do. That's why I'm so sorry my children are growing up in the Caribbean today. Whereas the previous political class had more vision and a sense of using the sovereign nation and transforming the society. The current group is a group of we can't do. But they never say we can't do when they're campaigning, you know. When they win the election, it's what they can't do that becomes important. Another feature of neoliberalism is the rejection of social welfare and social protection as legitimate responsibilities of the state. I want to repeat that. The rejection of social welfare and social protection as legitimate responsibilities of the state. Post-1945, look at the Moyne Commission. Let's go down history. You know the Moyne Commission, a British colonial commission, is more progressive than the current manifestos. The Moyne Commission said give people access to health care, give them access to proper sanitation, because the Moyne said people can't live like that. And then how many years down the road now? 50 years down the road, why would have ordinary politicians speaking like the Moyne Commission and say people need education, people need health care, and it is a legitimate function of the state to provide those things. Instead we're hearing about, no, the economy can't take it, and you need to get the fundamentals right. You see, I'm being a heretic tonight. You know why I'm being a heretic? Because I am abstracting myself from neoliberal ideology. I'm not taking it for granted. Those technocrats who want to take it for granted can do that. I will never take it for granted because I understand what politics is. Politics is a contestation of ideas. And politics is the study of who gets what, when, and how. So nobody can tell me that there is no alternative. The only time there is no alternative is when we're dead. During that time, there are several alternatives. You understand me? And I will show you too, when the business class come into office, they're not saying they can't do. You think Trump is saying he can't do? He's building a wall. He's expelling immigrants. So he's doing things. So the right wing can do things, but the left wing can't do because they believe in the neoliberal orthodoxy. You see the madness? So the people who are supposed to be fighting against neoliberal orthodoxy imbibe it so much that their hands are tied, and the so-called right wing is rejecting it every day by doing what they have to do. You get me? And another feature of it is the rejection of Benthamite concerns of the greatest happiness for the greatest number. I threw that in there because our independence projects were based on Bentham's notion of the greatest happiness for the greatest number as the litmus test of what governments should do. And let me read for you properly. The rejection of Benthamite concerns of the greatest happiness for the greatest number
as the litmus test of what governments should do, and the inability to make the question of what kinds of society we wish to create the starting point of politics. That's the starting point of politics. What kind of societies we wish to create. And that's how you write your manifesto, you know. When you ask that question first, what kind of society that me, as political leader of the XX party, wish to create, I write my manifesto. And then you, as the other party, ask the same question and you write your manifesto. But we don't ask these questions, because we can't ask these questions anymore. Instead, narrowly defined economic considerations form the starting point of what the state should do. So you see why I'm telling you part of my project is to question neoliberalism. I want to show you how it has led to Trump, Plato, how it has led to Trump, Shastny, and others. This then, what I just described for you, is how neoliberalism has facilitated the political rise of the business class. And I call this the neoliberalism's intellectual maneuver. Because I want to show you how they took both Plato and Trump, sorry, both Plato and James, to twist it to explain the neoliberal idea. A central notion of neoliberalism is the death of politics. In this view, all major ideological questions have been answered by the triumph of free market capitalism, and as a consequence, politics is reduced to mere administration or economic management. Within such a perspective, the new technocratic elite becomes the business class. Thus, Plato's group of specially trained persons for leadership become the successful business entrepreneurs. Business success is now equated with political wisdom and greatness. So you see, so Plato was rejecting the business class, but they have now said, but we are successful in our private enterprise, so we are the true. We are the ones, the same way we are successful as private entrepreneurs, that qualifies us to govern the society. So they turned Plato on his head, and they're now claiming we are now the philosopher kings. Now I'm talking about Trump, but the so-called, like Bill Gates and them, people have been writing about them, and the so-called aid. So no longer is the state to administer aids and those things. My foundation will behave like a government and go into Haiti and administer and resolve the health crisis. The one at Facebook has taken up, his wife is a medical doctor, has taken up childcare, and one or two others have taken up education. So they are now Plato's, the ones that Plato said could not and should not govern, based on what I described for you, have now emerged as saying, well, our business acumen proves that we are best able to govern. So y'all have failed. Y'all, if you are, what's the thing Americans say? If you were so bright, why are you so poor? That's what they say. If he's so, why he can't be successful if you're poor? You can be bright, and therefore we are successful, and we should govern. So business success is now equated with political wisdom and greatness. Paradoxically, remember I told you that C.L.R. James and Plato were at counter positions. Paradoxically, C.L.R. James' notion that every cook can govern, though on the surface contradicting Plato's notion of a government of specially trained individuals, is also operationalized within the neoliberal conception of politics. And I'll tell you how they do that. James's notion serves the neoliberal purpose of demystifying politics and lowering the qualification requirements for political leadership. Remember what happened? Let me give you a bit of history again. After universal suffrage, the business class could not govern, the old planter class could not govern because nobody would vote for them. In fact, one of the things they used to say is, those colored boys can't run anything. That's what they said, and I'm sure that's what they still say in their private dinner parties. That y'all, these black boys can run the state, but they stayed out of politics. And I want to contend, they stayed out of politics because they could govern the slave state, but they couldn't govern the democratic state. They stayed out of it. But now, the notion that every cook can govern, the notion that there's no big deal to politics, has now opened the door for them, right? So James demystified politics by lowering the qualification for leadership. Given that business persons have, in the context of the post-1930s political revolt, avoided or have been viewed as incapable of political leadership, James, by advancing the notion that there is nothing special about political leadership, has opened the door to a group previously excluded from political power. With the lowering of the entry bar to political leadership, the basis of the earlier exclusion of the business class from politics has been effectively removed. I am sure that you in St. Vincent have heard the opportunistic claim, especially around election time, as I said earlier, that anyone can be a prime minister. In fact, what I have discovered is that the more they see a good prime minister, the more they see that. Am I making sense to you? When you see a prime minister doing great things that you didn't think were possible, then you start saying in your mind, but you know anybody could be doing that in the first place? You know anybody could be a prime minister, but the man doing all those things. So instead of saying, as Plato did, that politics is a specific activity, I said to my students, can anybody be a preschool teacher? I'm waiting for your answer. You know that. You know why not? Because you walk into a preschool and you see somebody looking like me, and you walk away with your child. Because you know I can't be a preschool teacher. Not anybody can be a preschool teacher, but anybody can be a prime minister. You see the foolishness? The most difficult task, governing a society. But you can do it, or anybody can be a prime minister. So that's what James did. So the business groups, formerly excluded from politics, have been, what Trump would say, I'm sorry for falling on him, I'm the most presidential. He's the most everything, except the most stupid. The pro-business groups, formerly excluded from politics, have been significantly emboldened by the view that political experience, and that's the important point, is no barrier, political inexperience is no barrier to leadership. According to the new perspective, not only is business experience an asset, but political experience is overrated as criteria for leadership. Remember, in the election, the professional politicians are the ones who destroyed the country. The lifelong politicians, the fellows who were in the Senate for several years, are the ones to blame for the crisis. And give it to anybody, or give it to an outsider, because the insiders cannot govern. Finally, these shifts have taken place in the context in which the classical notion of the organic state have been negated. And that's an important point. Individuals are no longer guaranteed their security of existence as part of an organic society. So whatever Plato said, and whatever James had said, the dominant idea was the organic state, that the whole society mattered. But today, we're not preaching anybody can govern, but an important thing missing is the idea of the organic state. When Thatcher's notion that there is no such thing as society is combined with the separation of the economy from society, then Plato's concerns about the self-interestedness of the producer class assume new urgency. However, far from being viewed as problematic, under the neoliberal worldview, the marriage between business and politics is presented as being good for society as a whole. That's the organic pretense. Get my logic? So they're not saying we're governing for ourselves, They're maintaining the organic pretense that you need me, Trump, to make America great again. So I'm doing it not for myself, but for the good of society. So they're claiming to be organic. Of course, the day after, you saw who he appointed, of course. I'll come to that. But on the campaign, I'm doing it imagine a billionaire is the voice of unemployed people. How did it happen to us in the 21st century? You see why I had to go through this long thing with neoliberal ideology? Because I was watching it on my TV, and I couldn't believe it. People drinking that thing. A billionaire is a private jet is the voice of the ordinary person. Can you imagine that? People would never go on a plane. That man had become their salvation, or the voice of their salvation. You see what neoliberalism had done? Because he had money. And the ruling class is that business class. He can govern because he can put his name on a few buildings. Imagine that? And Plato was warning against that from day one. The producers cannot govern. They are self-interested. They cannot think of society as a whole. They are motivated by their appetites and their greed and so forth. But in the 21st century, the so-called bright people, you see why I study Plato? You see? That's why I study Plato. So the organic pretense is also sustained by the fact that under neoliberalism, oh yeah, that's an important point. The organic pretense is also sustained by the fact that under neoliberalism, it is the state that has now become the enemy. So not the private sphere, the state is bad. The state is a bad thing. Politics is bad. The state is the barrier to development. The state is inefficient. I'm sure there are civil servants in the room who've heard that song all the time, and I always laugh. I say, look at them, govern without the state. But the state is a negative thing. The political rule of the business class is now seen as being in the interest of society as a whole. And the business class has replaced Plato's philosopher king. Money and wealth has now replaced intellect and wisdom as the criteria for leadership. I promise you, my theoretical discourse is over. I told you, to bear with me a little bit. I was going to go through some theory. Now let's just look at the practical application. You all with me still? Good. So let's turn to Chasney now. I want to give concrete evidence of bad government under the business class. Well, at least I'm going to show you how he emerged first, and I'll come to the bad government part later. When Chasney emerged in the politics of St. Lucia in January 27, 2007, he represented a sharp divergence away from the traditional trade union or community-oriented activist politician. Remember them? The labor leaders of the 1930s and so forth? So Chasney represented a sharp divergence from that. Appointed to the Senate in 2007, following the victory of John Compton, Chasney found a foothold into St. Lucian politics, not through direct political engagement, but by being sponsored by the country's father of independence, John Compton. Prior to this, Chasney had little known involvement in St. Lucian politics. His most prominent public roles had been as an employee of Jamaican Gordon Butch Stewart, Air Jamaica. He would later serve as a member of the St. Lucia Tourist Board. Whilst public perception of Chasney is that of a businessman, it is more accurate to say that it is his father, Michael Chasney, owner of the prominent retail chain Super J, and owner of the two hotels, Coco Creole and Coco Palm, who is the genuine businessman around which his son Alan has staked his entrepreneurship claims. In other words, Chasney don't own any business in St. Lucia. His father is the businessman. Nevertheless, this claim to business experience was the main pillar upon which Chasney's political career was built. Following Compton's death in office in September 2007, Chasney was retained as tourism minister by the new Prime Minister Stevenson King. However, in 2011, King's UWP suffered political defeat by the hand of Kenny Anthony's SLP, during which Chasney had his first taste of political elections. He ran as a candidate for a southern constituency and lost. It is in this context of the defeat of the UWP in the 2011 election that Chasney positioned himself for leadership of the UWP. And it is in this context, too, that neoliberalism created a context conducive to his emergence, first as UWP leader and later as Prime Minister. First, the view of Chasney as an outsider fulfilled the requirement of the need for freshness in the period following the death of Compton. So the same thing about Trump. Oh, he's an outsider. Chasney is an outsider too, and that's a good thing. Can you imagine? Secondly, Chasney's image as a businessman satisfied the neoliberal claim that despite his relative lack of political experience, his exposure to money qualified him for political leadership. For those who have doubts about Chasney's consciousness of himself as a champion of a new business class, conscious of itself as remaking Caribbean politics rather than as a mere historical accident, which some people assume that he is, you should let Chastney speak for himself. I have the last slide, the last bullet point at the bottom there, where he said, now people understand that the shareholders are really the taxpayers and voters of this country. The board of directors is the cabinet, and the senior management is the civil service, and the statutory bodies are the subsidiaries. You heard the foolishness? Now, of course, you don't know it is foolishness yet. You know why? Because a lot of you think it's making sense. That sounds normal to you, right? Let me tell you why I call it foolishness. That is the language reflective of an ideology that conflates the complex world of politics with its myriad levels of interest and compromise, give and take, undergirded by the larger question of national development. I'm describing politics for you there. I'm describing government for you there. And I'm comparing it to that. Let me describe government for you. A complex world of politics with its myriad levels of interest and compromise, give and take, undergirded by the larger question of national development, interspersed with the overarching questions of international relations and the global political economy. Chastney is reducing this complex thing to that, with the simple world of profit-making and single service or single unit production of the business world. Let me explain that. If you're producing shoes as your beginning and end, your alpha and omega, this makes perfect sense. I'm producing shoes, a board of management, senior management, a board of governors, and so forth. A subsidiary, the man making the leather, is my subsidiary. But you're producing shoes. Profits rise and fall, people buying shoes, you make a profit. Things get a little tight, women buying less shoes, you lay off 10 people. That's easy. But politics, where you have a whole set of competing interests, hurricanes coming, people unemployed, international relations, ISIS dropping bombs and so forth. You reducing it to that? Well, of course, that sounded nice to you when you heard it, right? Because it sounded normal, but it's nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Government is not running a business. But in today's world, the person who spews this Kool-Aid passes off as clever and brilliant. All of those debilitating tendencies and weaknesses of neoliberalism were seen in his 2016 election manifesto. The manifesto bore the stamp of the deliberate emphasis on the role of money and private sector participation as the key to development. And it reversed the previous social democratic emphasis of the SLP. The manifesto was replete with references to Chastney's business success as an indicator of the possibilities which can be achieved once he had been entrusted with leadership. For example, in its message from the political leader, and I'm quoting for you, the manifesto claimed that throughout his life, Chastney had worked hard to create employment and wealth for all the stakeholders in the businesses he managed. But despite his success in doing so, he found himself surrounded by poverty and deprivation in St. Lucia. You had a colonial mindset? I'm so successful. I made Butch rich, and my father is rich. And I have done well in the private businesses. But when I look around St. Lucia, I see poverty and think, let me govern the society. That's what he's saying. Similarly, the economic section of the manifesto was unabashed in its promises to businesses, such as exemptions from property tax and the reduction in corporate tax. Relatedly and presumably, because of Chastney's supposed business acumen, the manifesto promised to achieve an accumulated growth rate of 12% in the first term. 12% growth. The magic European-looking businessman will bring magical growth to St. Lucia. 12% in the first 5 years, accumulated growth. When all over the world in the Caribbean region, we barely making 0.1% growth and those things, because he's a businessman. Finally, the manifesto also emphasized the UWP's belief that entrepreneurship and private sector development are the keys to diversifying the economy, and I can go on, but I will not continue. These themes were built upon during the 2016 election campaign itself. During the campaign, Chasney's association with Caribbean business colleagues played a key role in painting the image of a well-connected and high-profile regional personality commanding regional support. His past association with Gordon Booth Stewart played a critical role in that regard. Stewart was among the first public personalities to offer a congratulatory message to Chasney. Chasney was his employee. And the Minister of Tourism, Dominique Fede, was his employee. So he has a Prime Minister and a Minister of Tourism who trembled before him as their boss. And about 3 hotel chains in St. Lucia, with about 2 more to come. That is the reality of the leadership. We should be careful, however, not to assume that these developments are specific to St. Lucia and are not reflected elsewhere in the Caribbean. Chasney can be seen as only the most extreme manifestation of this tendency. In the island of Barbados, we have seen developments which further illustrate the conflation of political leadership with business success. There's a new party calling itself Solutions Barbados, and that party has been making a deliberate case for election of persons with business experience as a solution to the economic challenges of Barbados. The party's website makes an open appeal for prospective candidates, and I'm quoting, who have any type of management experience, including managing a business, department, organization, or team. Of course, they changed that after they got a backlash because the original website was saying they wanted people who run businesses. Now, can you imagine a political party calling for candidates on a website? Do you understand what I'm trying to tell you? You see how it has been, what it has been reduced to? As opposed to political parties in an organic way, leadership emerging. That's how leadership emerges, my friends. It's not created. It emerges. I can walk into a room of preschool children, I can tell you who the leader is. You understand me? You can see community organizers. Obama was a community organizer. In fact, that's why Trump is the antithesis to him, the Harvard graduate who went on to Chicago inner cities. As a community, in fact, they were mocking him. Oh, he's a community organizer. He can't be president. That's how you become a politician. By being a community organizer. First, in fact, what happens to a lot of ours, especially those who just left UWI, they're entering straight to the top too. That's the technocratic types. Straight to the top. Nobody is now, when I teach my students and I tell them, they all want to study, and I know one or two of them are in here, they all want to study international relations. You know why? Because they want to be in Geneva. So the class full of political science students, but they all want to study international relations. They don't want to study, like I did, I teach them political science pure. They're interested in international relations because they want to be in Brussels and Geneva. They don't want to be among poor people in the Caribbean. In fact, so I tell them, good luck with your international relations. You'll be doing meet and greets at the airport. That's what I say to them. You'll be doing meet and greets at the airport. And I leave them alone. Let them in there. Instead, I tell them, why you don't find yourself down in the base? Even when you join a political party, you have to be a candidate. Why join the constituency group, no? You just left university. Go and join your same village you came from. Go and join a constituency group. Talk to the old people. Then you will emerge as a candidate in a few years. But they want to be prime minister. And I will not go into, I can give you some examples of the silliness on that website. So in fact, you can check it for yourself. Some of the things you read, a set of technical solutions masquerading as, let me give you an example off my head. He talks about he's going to ban all civil servants from participating in politics. Good luck with that. Foolishness. And the thing is, because of course, politics is not technocratic management. Anyway, so I'm trying to tell you these are the developments that you see reflected in Caribbean politics. But let me turn, of course, to Trump. Now, I deliberately left Trump for last because I didn't want you to think that I was saying that Trump caused the development in the Caribbean. Okay? I have deliberately left Trump for last, since I'm trying to avoid the insinuation that it is Trumpism which has given rise to the Caribbean businessman politician. Instead, what I am arguing here is that they are all products of the same architectonic forces associated with the triumph of neoliberalism. Trump represents only the sharpest global manifestation of these tendencies, but he is not a catalyst of them. He is symptom rather than cause. Be that as it may, the parallels with the Caribbean experience and the reflections of the neoliberal worldview in the Trump experience can be seen in a number of ways. First, Trump's status as a political outsider was trumpeted as a key factor in his proposed ability to transform politics and to drain the swamp. Secondly, his lack of political experience was sold as a positive, while the professional politicians personified in his opponent, Hillary Clinton, were cast as being primarily responsible for the economic and social challenges confronting the country. Thirdly, given the subsuming of politics within economics, Trump's business success was identified as his main qualification for the presidency. Despite his lack of knowledge on matters of foreign policy, Trump saw himself as being able to lead since he reduced international relations to personal deal-making with foreign leaders, similar to actions undertaken in his private business negotiations. Fourthly, much of Trump's campaign was based on the disavowal that leadership required special experience or special learning. This was reflected most clearly in his disdainful mocking of Hillary Clinton during the campaign for spending hours and days preparing for presidential debates, as if policy thinking for the most powerful country in the world required no special intellectual effort. You see, remember? He was mocking her and saying, we couldn't find Hillary for 3 days because she was studying. What is a leader supposed to do? So you want to run the most powerful country, but he's so bright that he has everything up there, and she is not a true politician because she's preparing for leadership. Can you imagine? Fifthly, the hegemony of neoliberal thinking can be seen in the post-election cabinet and other governmental appointments of wealthy business persons and close relatives without political experience. Thus, in addition to important advisory roles for his daughter and son-in-law, Trump has appointed Rex Tillerson, ExxonMobil ex-CEO, as Secretary of State, Betsy DeVos, a billionaire with little knowledge or association with the public school system, as Education Secretary, and Scott Pruitt, a pro-oil lobbyist and a climate change skeptic, to head the EPA. He has more recently boasted that I just don't want a poor person in top economic role. However, we should not be too alarmed and defeated by these developments. We should take comfort in the fact that the direct rule by capitalists in a capitalist economic system may itself be a critical symptom of a deep crisis of capitalism itself. Let me explain that, because we now come into the positives in those developments. I'm saying we should take comfort in the fact that the direct rule by capitalists in a capitalist economic system may itself be a critical symptom of a deep crisis of capitalism itself. I'll return to this claim more directly in my conclusion, which I assure you is fast approaching, because I know you're tired. But in the meantime, I invite you to take comfort in the fact that the short experience of the government by the businessmen have strongly validated Plato's claims that businessmen make bad rulers. The evidence of bad government and poor leadership in the USA under Trump is too well known for me to engage you with that tonight. What may be less well known is the fact that despite his electoral victory, Chasney's early period of leadership thus far has provided ample evidence of bad government. On the second sitting and first official working day of Parliament, a news report which I will show you in 1 second, was able to capture the public collective shock and embarrassment when the Prime Minister appeared overwhelmed by the task of piloting a bill through Parliament. On that occasion, Chastanet appeared unable to cite the appropriate sections of the standing orders, unable to clarify the relevant stage of the bill which he was wishing to pass. And I'm going to show you for 5 minutes so you can see that I'm not bad talking to man. I want you to see it for yourself so you can get a sense of what is happening.
Well, it was a rough day at the office, not only for rookie Prime Minister Alan Chastanet, but quite a few other parliamentarians. Prime Minister Chastanet appeared to be having problems navigating.
If you can show you, the audio can capture it to you.
Well, it was a rough day at the office, not only for rookie Prime Minister. A few other parliamentarians. Prime Minister Chastanet appeared to be having problems navigating his way through his second sitting as leader of government business in the House of Assembly. Miguel Fabry has that story.
I beg for the suspension. Sorry. I beg for the first reading.
Apology upon apology upon apology was the order of the day as Prime Minister Alan Chastanet tried to find his footing. The Prime Minister's inexperience clearly showed during the presentation of the Intergovernmental Agreement Bill for its first reading. Former Prime Minister Stephenson King stepped in to assist, clearly audible on Chastanet's hot mic.
48.2 be suspended in... Oh, sorry. I beg to present a bill standing in my name, which is shortly entitled Intergovernmental Agreement. And I beg that the
Intergovernmental Agreement, St. Lucia and the United States of America.
The Prime Minister's intention was for the bill to go through all its stages at Tuesday's sitting, but he had a bit of trouble explaining so. The Castries North MP came to the rescue once again.
third reading of the bill, Madam Speaker. Oh, sorry. Sorry, that the report be adopted and that we have a third reading of the bill and passed. Be read. I beg that the report be read for a third time and then it be passed. Thank you.
Prime Minister Chastanet's missteps may have been a bit too much for Madam Speaker, who passed on notes with pointers via the Sergeant-at-Arms.
Madam Speaker, I beg for the suspension of Standing Order 48-2 and to allow the bill to go through its Madam Speaker, I move that this bill be moved to be read a second time at the next subsequent meeting of this Honorable House.
You see? You see all my talk? You see all the talk I was talking this a while ago? You all thought I was talking nonsense, right? But on the outside, the businessman, right? All the externals are there. And when you're in the region here and see him on TV, you think, wow, St. Lucia, the Prime Minister. He can't read. You see? But of course, all of the other trappings of office, thank you, were there, and therefore he qualified for leadership. Far more troubling for the question of governance has been Chasnay's narrow application of business practices to politics. Amongst the clearest examples of his narrow association of politics with business was his decision to contract the private accounting firm Ernst & Young to prepare St. Lucia's 2017 budget. They're all there, right? So, significantly, let me repeat that. He contracted Ernst & Young, the private accounting firm, to shape the 2017 budget. He justified the decision. Now, you know the American Parliament would the American Congress would never do that. You understand me? There is no way a body of elected persons would abrogate their responsibility to shaping public policy to a private accounting firm. You see, when you think politics is now, if it is a private hotel, you can do that. You get my logic? If it's a private hotel, you can contract Ernst & Young to balance your books for you. But you're running a country, and people were duly elected. He justified the decision on the basis that the public sector had very limited knowledge of new and modern approaches to taxation. You see again, the neoliberal disdain for the public sector. You think anybody in the public sector, you think he has ability that comes close to anybody in the public sector? But the pretense of his class, that he is better because of wealth. I deliberately, you might think I'm a bit cruel, right? I deliberately demonstrated for you so that you could contextualize everything else I have to tell you. Whatever the explanation, this begs the question of the appropriateness of conceding such wide swathes of public responsibility to a private firm to determine the revenue and expenditure priorities of a democratically elected government. Further, whilst an elected government will be guided by notions of public accountability, a privately contracted accounting firm is not so concerned. In addition to this transfer of decision-making power to non-elected sources of authority, Chasnay's limited businessman perspective has also facilitated the return to the capitulation to external business interests. While several examples abound, the development which illustrates most starkly the direct capitulation of the Chasnay government to the dictates of foreign capital is the issue that has become known as the DSH issue in St. Lucia. The DSH issue refers to a controversial decision by the Chasnay administration to agree to the terms of a Chinese-based investment, Desert Star Holdings, which essentially would give the company 65 acres of land for the setting up of a horsing racetrack and related developments, and 92 acres to the south of the international airport, and occupying a significant beach front for comprehensive tourism project, inclusive of hotels, a marina, and casinos, with a further possibility of an additional 90 acres for the possible setting up of offshore tertiary institutions. The land area considered to the project would include several key existing developments central to St. Lucia, including a meat processing plant that currently exists, a solid waste landfill, the National Stadium, and a wildlife mangrove. One of the more controversial aspects of the agreement was the low cost at which the land was being offered, with the developers either given the option of purchasing the land at between US 60 to 90,000, or to lease the property at a cost of $1 per acre for 99 years. In addition, DSH would be exempt from income tax on interest earned, VAT, property tax, aliens landholding licenses, stamp duties and vendors' taxes, custom duties of imports, corporate tax, and any other exemptions prescribed in the Tourism Investment Act. In addition to all of this, Chasney exhibited a high degree of political inexperience in the finalizing of the agreement by traveling to China with no technical staff and personally announcing that he had read the agreement and it had been given his approval. This led one public commentator to comment that given Chasney's inability to read the standing orders on the opening working day of Parliament, it was unlikely that he had the wherewithal to understand the complexities of an investment agreement of such magnitude. What is clear, however, is that the investment has led to a tremendous public outcry, which has shocked the new and inexperienced government into the complexities of the world of politics and public life. Since the announcement, the country has witnessed sustained protests, particularly in the south of the island. Equally significant is the spontaneous nature of the protests and the fact that they have been organized particularly by the young people, independent of the direction of the opposition party, and the government has appeared increasingly isolated in its decision on the investment. It is clear, therefore, that Plato's concern about intellectual preparation as a sine qua non of good political leadership has been confirmed rather than overturned by the Chasney experience thus far. So my conclusion, and you can breathe a sigh of relief now. In conclusion, therefore, what then are the lessons for the future of Caribbean politics in the short to medium term? It is my view that all of these developments reveal the transformation of the ideas of leadership, governance, and politics itself away from its classical expressions in Greek antiquity under Plato. So, Ms. Dalrymple, I hope I have fulfilled my task. A central concern of Plato's prescription was the need to avoid bad government. To Plato, the easiest route to bad government was to allow government to fall in the hands of those who are not equipped to govern, chief among whom were the producers, inclusive of the business class. Plato was clear in his warnings against underestimating the burdens of political leadership, and he cautioned strongly against electing those who were unprepared for leadership, since, in his words, this would lead to the ruin, not only in the ruin of the rulers themselves, but to the ruin of the whole state. There is much evidence in the politics of the USA, the Caribbean, and elsewhere, that the election of persons with business experience and the election of persons who fail to understand that political leadership requires a specific nobility of character has compounded rather than resolved the challenges of governance or development. It is clear that not any cook can govern. As for the future, it is my view that the current moment calls for a more heightened degree of political activity from the historically progressive social democratic forces of the Caribbean. The present moment is one of both optimism and pessimism. The pessimism lies in the concrete reality of the actual takeover of our politics by the business class and represents a moment of triumph of neoliberalism in which its theoretical claims are being backed up by political victories. Dialectically, however, the moment represents a simultaneous moment of collapse and defeat of neoliberalism. It is Hegel that reminds us that the highest stage at which any something can reach is the stage at which it begins to perish. We are also informed that something, any something, an idea, a social formation, or an institutional principle can only be said to reach its highest stage when all its principles are taken for granted and there is no more room in it for further development. The full negative effects of capitalism had always been mediated by its social veil, in which political power was transferred into the hands of the non-bourgeois technical managerial class. Always. It was always governed by a class other than the owners of capital. That's why it survived. However, when, as in the present moment, the bourgeoisie seeks to govern directly without the mediation of the technical managerial middle class, we are indeed in the highest stage prior to the moment of collapse. There are myriad signs to suggest that Trump's moment of victory coincides with the moment of the collapse of the USA's capital world leadership. Similarly, the emergence of the CEO politician in the Caribbean is coming after several decades of crisis of post-colonial development, when the independence project appears to have lost its steam and has entered crisis. Chasney and the business class represent the symptom and not the solution to that crisis. For the last 4 decades, Caribbean social democracy has been beaten back and has lost its voice. My message to the Vincentian and Caribbean progressive forces tonight is that we should see the moment not as one of defeat, but as the opening of a new window for the re-emergence of the left, as the business politicians demonstrate concretely that they cannot resolve a crisis which was caused by the very class to which they belong. It is now time for the social, democratic, progressive left forces to re-emerge forward ever.